I used to shop at Target all the time, especially at the location near my house. It was convenient, had everything I needed, and was always my go-to store for groceries and other essentials. But after what happened to me there, I haven't been back, and honestly, I don't know if I ever will. What started as a routine shopping trip turned into a series of creepy and downright unsettling encounters that I can't seem to shake. It all began one evening after work. I stopped by Target to grab groceries and a few other things I needed for the week. The store wasn't particularly busy, which made shopping easy and quick. I spent about 30 minutes filling up my cart and eventually made my way to the back of the store to the cold section. I always saved the refrigerated and frozen items for last, so they wouldn't thaw before I got home. That section of the store was completely empty, just me and the quiet hum of the freezers. As I opened one of the freezer doors to grab something, I noticed movement behind the shelves. At first, I thought it might be an employee restocking items from the back room, which was right behind the freezers. But then I saw more clearly. Someone was standing behind the shelves. They weren't wearing the usual red shirt and khakis of a Target employee. Instead, they were dressed entirely in black, and their face was obscured by a ski mask. I froze. It wasn't funny or harmless anymore. It was unsettling. I moved further down the aisle, pretending to examine another product, and the masked person moved with me, keeping pace on the other side of the shelves. The gaps between the shelves allowed me to catch glimpses of them as they crept along. Their eyes locked on me the entire time. My heart started racing as I realized just how bizarre the situation was. Finally, I reached for the last item I needed. As I grabbed it, the masked man suddenly shoved an entire box of the same item toward me, causing several packages to tumble onto the floor. I quickly picked them up, avoiding his gaze, and when I looked back up, he had vanished into the back room. Shaken, I decided to report it to an employee. I found a young woman stocking shelves a few aisles over and told her what had happened. She looked concerned and assured me she'd check it out. I watched her walk toward the backroom doors, which were near the freezer section. She disappeared inside, but when she came back out a minute later, she looked confused. "There's no one back there," she said. I hadn't seen anyone leave the area, which made the whole situation even stranger. I shrugged it off and finished my shopping, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. After paying for my items, I headed home, trying to convince myself it was just some weird prank or a misunderstanding. A week later, I went back to the same Target. This trip was uneventful at first. I did my shopping in about 30 minutes and headed out to my car. As I was loading my groceries into the trunk, I glanced around the parking lot. Everything seemed normal until I started driving out. That's when I saw him again, the same man in the ski mask. He was halfway hidden behind a bush near the edge of the parking lot, and as I drove past, he stepped out and stared directly at me. My stomach dropped. It was undeniably the same guy. What were the chances of seeing him again? He wasn't doing anything overtly threatening, but the way he was just standing there, watching me, sent chills down my spine. I drove away quickly, trying to shake the unease that followed me home. For the next couple of weeks, I avoided going to Target altogether. But eventually, I needed groceries, and I decided to give it another shot. This time, it was nighttime, and the store was quiet. I parked my car about halfway back in the parking lot and went inside. The trip was uneventful, and I managed to get everything I needed without any issues. When I returned to my car, I loaded my groceries and got into the driver's seat. As I started the engine, something caught my eye. The car parked next to mine, a plain white sedan, had looked empty at first glance. But now, I saw movement inside. Someone was crawling from the back seat into the front passenger seat. It was him, the man in the ski mask. He turned his head and looked directly at me through the windows. For a few seconds, we stared at each other, and I was too shocked to move. Then, he opened his door and stepped out. I watched in disbelief as he walked toward my car and grabbed the handle of my driver's door. Thankfully, I had just locked it. He leaned in, pressing his face against my window, his eyes boring into mine through the glass. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I yelled for him to go away. He didn't move. I threw my car into reverse, and as I backed up, he grabbed onto my car, trying to keep up. Finally, as I drove forward, he let go and ran back to his car. I sped out of the parking lot and onto a busier street. not stopping until I was far away. I pulled into a random parking lot, turned off my lights, and waited, watching the road. A few moments later, a white sedan sped past. I'm certain it was him. That was the last time I went to that Target. I don't know why this man keeps appearing or why he seems to target me specifically. What does he want? Is it just a coincidence? Or is something else going on? What would you do if you were in my situation? Should I report this to someone? Or am I overthinking it? And most importantly, why do you think this man keeps showing up? I used to work at Target over a year ago. At the time, it was the perfect job for me, conveniently located just a short drive from my apartment and a great way to meet people. I worked primarily in the clothing department, organizing racks and helping customers find what they needed. It was usually a low-stress job, especially compared to the chaos of the grocery section. I enjoyed chatting with coworkers, and over time, I got to know a lot of them pretty well. But one encounter during my time there left me shaken and has stayed with me ever since. It all started on what seemed like an ordinary day. I was working in the women's clothing section, straightening up displays and putting misplaced items back where they belonged. The store wasn't busy. It was a calm, uneventful shift. That's when I noticed a tall man approaching me. Assuming he was a customer with a question, I smiled and asked how I could help. The man stared at me for a moment, a strange grin spreading across his face, before saying, "Yes, you can help me by going out with me tonight." I laughed nervously. I wasn't interested in going out with anyone, let alone a random customer. I quickly lied, telling him I had a boyfriend. This was my usual way of deflecting unwanted advances. It worked most of the time. But this man didn't take the hint. "No, you don't," he replied, his grin widening. I insisted that I did and tried to steer the conversation back to work. "Is there something I can help you find?" I asked, hoping to change the subject. His next response sent a chill down my spine. "Yes," he said, his voice lowering slightly, "directions to your house." I forced another awkward laugh, pretending I thought he was joking. But inside, I was beginning to feel uneasy. I told him I had work to do and wished him a good day before walking away, hoping to lose him in the maze of clothing racks. To my dismay, he followed. Every time I moved to a different section, he shadowed me. Finally, I stopped, turned to face him, and said, "Why are you following me? You're really starting to creep me out." He raised his hands defensively, muttered a quick apology, and walked away. Relieved, I went back to my work, hoping that was the last I'd see of him. But hours later, I spotted him again. He was still in the store, lurking near the clothing section. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but then I noticed him glancing in my direction and quickly looking away. He was partially hidden behind a rack of clothes, watching me. My unease turned into full-blown anxiety. I left the area, heading to the grocery section, hoping he wouldn't follow. But not long after, I saw him again. This time, he disappeared into a nearby aisle as soon as he spotted me. I decided I'd had enough. I radioed my supervisor, letting her know I was taking my break, and headed to the break room near the front of the store. Once inside, I sat down and tried to calm myself. I couldn't believe the man was still there, seemingly watching me for hours. I stayed in the break room longer than usual, hoping he'd leave. When I returned to the floor, I didn't see him again, and I finished my shift without further incident. By the time I left the store and drove home, I had almost convinced myself that it was over. But the following week, the situation escalated. It was another quiet evening shift, and I was nearly done for the day. As I worked, I received a call on my walkie-talkie. Someone asked for me, which wasn't unusual, though I didn't recognize the voice. The person asked me to switch to channel 3 for a private message. This was standard procedure for more specific instructions, so I switched over and responded. The voice on the other end told me I was needed in receiving to help with something. Receiving was in the back of the store, an area I occasionally helped out in but didn't frequent. I agreed and started walking back there. When I arrived, the area was eerily quiet. I expected to see someone waiting for me, but there was no one around. Confused, I called out on the walkie, asking where they were. That's when I heard my voice echo faintly from another walkie nearby. I followed the sound, which led me to one of the doors leading outside. It was slightly ajar, and standing near it, partially hidden behind a shelf, was the same man from last week. My stomach dropped as he stepped out, his face partially obscured by shadows. "That was you on the walkie, wasn't it?" I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. Instead, he started walking toward me. I instinctively backed away, realizing how much taller he was and how isolated I was. When I turned to run, he grabbed my arm and started pulling me backward. I screamed, but the receiving area was so far from the rest of the store that I doubted anyone would hear me. Just as panic fully set in, the doors to the shopping area opened, and my coworker Amy walked in. "What's going on?" she demanded. The man let go of me immediately and sprinted out the door into the night. Shaking, I explained everything to Amy. She told me she had overheard the call on the walkie and thought it was strange. She hadn't recognized the voice and decided to check on me, just in case. We called the police, who discovered the man had purchased a walkie-talkie and tuned it to our store's frequency. Unfortunately, they couldn't do much since he was long gone by the time they arrived. I worked at Target for a few more months after that and never saw him again, but the memory still haunts me. What do you think his intentions were? Should stores improve security to prevent incidents like this? And how would you have handled the situation if you were in my place? 5 years ago, I worked at Target as a cart attendant. It was one of the best jobs I've ever had, simple, mostly stress-free, and honestly pretty enjoyable. I liked being outside, moving around the parking lot, and the work was straightforward. My store was a super Target in a busy area, surrounded by other shops and restaurants, which meant the parking lot could get hectic, especially on busy days. But it also meant there was always something going on. While most shifts were uneventful, one night stood out as the scariest experience I've ever had. It was a typical busy day, and by the time my evening shift rolled around, the chaos of the daytime rush had settled. The parking lot was quiet, but scattered with stray carts. Days like this were challenging because the carts weren't just left in the corrals. Some were abandoned across the far corners of the lot. Around 9 p.m., I headed to the northeast corner of the parking lot to grab a cart that had been left against the curb, far from the store. As I reached for the cart, an SUV pulled into the lot through an entrance nearby. I thought it would keep driving toward a parking space, but instead, it stopped directly in front of me, awkwardly blocking 2 spaces and part of the driving lane. I glanced up, confused, as the driver's door opened and a man stepped out. "Hey," he called out, waving at me. I paused, unsure of what he wanted, but I responded politely. "Yeah? Do you need help with something?" He smiled and walked closer. "Maybe you can help me out," he said. "Something's wrong with my car, and I don't know much about fixing stuff like this." The man was short but stocky, with a somewhat rough appearance. I wasn't exactly a car expert, but I figured I could at least take a look. Then he said something that sent alarm bells ringing in my head. "Can you get in the back seat and listen for the weird noise while I drive?" I froze, caught off guard by the bizarre request. It didn't make sense, and it felt incredibly sketchy. I shook my head and quickly said, "Actually, I don't know much about cars, so I probably wouldn't be much help." I turned back to grab the cart and started walking toward the store. "Wait," he called after me, but I didn't stop. My gut was telling me to get out of there. The sound of his footsteps behind me made my heart race. They grew faster, matching my pace. I sped up, and so did he. That's when I knew I had to run. I bolted toward the store, sprinting with the cart as fast as I could. The man kept up for a few seconds, but eventually fell behind. By the time I reached the doors and got inside, I was out of breath but relieved to be safe. I glanced back and didn't see him anywhere. Deciding it was best to avoid that side of the parking lot for the rest of my shift, I stayed close to the store as I worked. For a while, everything seemed fine. When I looked toward the corner of the lot where the man had been, both he and the SUV were gone. I finished collecting the remaining carts, and it was finally time for my last break of the night. I headed to the break room, grabbed a seat, and pulled out my phone to scroll through social media. It was quiet. Most of the evening shift workers had already left, and the overnight crew hadn't fully clocked in yet. I was alone, which was fine by me. About halfway through my break, I heard the door to the break room open and close. The sound didn't faze me at first. I assumed it was another employee coming in, but when no one walked into the room, I started to feel uneasy. A strange sensation crept over me, the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, and there he was. The man from the parking lot stood in the doorway, staring directly at me. My blood ran cold as he started walking toward me, his steps deliberate and slow. I shot out of my chair and ran for the other exit without a second thought. The break room led to a small employee-only area with a desk and a door to the outside. No one else was around, so I bolted through the exit and back into the parking lot. I sprinted to the store's main entrance, burst through the doors, and found my manager. I told her everything, from the parking lot encounter to the break room. She immediately called security, but by the time they checked the area, the man was gone. After that, I worked cautiously for the rest of my shift, keeping an eye on the parking lot every time I went outside. Thankfully, I didn't see him again that night, and I never saw him again during the rest of my time at Target. But I still think about that night. What were his intentions? Why did he follow me into the break room? And how did he even get into the store? What would you have done in my situation? Should stores improve security to prevent people like him from entering employee-only areas? And most importantly, why do you think he wanted me to get in his car? I used to work as a manager at Target, and while I've had my share of odd moments, nothing compares to the night before Christmas when I was left alone in a massive super Target. Being a manager, it was my job to close up the store and ensure everything was ready for the next day. The other employees had left early to celebrate Christmas Eve with their families, leaving me alone to finish up. Normally, I didn't mind working solo. It gave me a chance to straighten up displays and prepare the store in peace. But that night turned into something I'll never forget. Super Targets are enormous. Just walking from one side of the store to the other could take minutes. The emptiness made the space feel even larger, every sound amplified by the silence. As I walked through the aisles fixing displays and organizing shelves, I heard a faint rustling sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, maybe a display settling or some loose items shifting. But when I stopped to listen, the sound vanished as quickly as it had started. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself I was just overtired. I hadn't been sleeping well, and the eerie stillness of the empty store wasn't helping. But as I continued working, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I turned a corner, I half expected someone to be there, but the aisles were always empty. Then, out of nowhere, the intercom system crackled to life. The sound was deafening in the silence, making my heart skip a beat. It was garbled, almost like someone was speaking, but I couldn't make out the words. Adrenaline surged as I ran to the nearest phone, and sure enough, the handset was dangling off the receiver. I hung it up, trying to calm my nerves, telling myself it must have fallen and accidentally hit a button. Deep down, though, I wasn't convinced. I had heard about people pulling pranks in stores, especially around the holidays. Kids hiding overnight to make videos for YouTube or just to get a laugh. I figured that's what this had to be, but that thought didn't make me feel any better. As I made my way through the toy section, I noticed something even stranger. Toys that had been neatly arranged earlier were now scattered across the floor, like a child had been playing with them. At this point, frustration started to creep in. I was tired, on edge, and now cleaning up someone else's mess. I called out, half expecting a group of teenagers to jump out, laughing at their successful prank. But the store stayed silent. I decided to search the aisles more thoroughly, checking every corner and calling out again. Still, there was no response. I briefly considered calling the police, but without solid proof of an intruder, it felt premature. I convinced myself that maybe I was overreacting, that the mess was just a coincidence, and tried to move on. But then I reached the cereal aisle, and everything changed. As I walked past the shelves, a loud buzzing sound startled me. A flash of light flickered behind a box of Fruity Pebbles. I hesitated, then reached behind the box to find an old iPhone. The screen lit up with an incoming call, but before I could answer, the phone died, its battery completely drained. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of the standard Apple wallpaper. Nothing distinctive, just the default image. At this point, my frustration turned to fear. Someone had left that phone there on purpose. This wasn't just a random prank. It was deliberate. Determined to put an end to it, I decided to check the back rooms. If someone was hiding, that's where they'd be. The back rooms were even quieter than the store. The rows of shelves and equipment cast long, eerie shadows under the fluorescent lights. I checked every corner, opening doors and calling out, but there was no one there. Exhausted and confused, I sat down on a crate, trying to make sense of it all. That's when the lights went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating. I fumbled for my phone, using its flashlight to illuminate my surroundings. Without a second thought, I bolted for the main exit. As I ran through the store, I could have sworn I heard footsteps behind me, growing louder as I approached the front doors. I didn't stop to look back. I burst through the doors into the cold night air and kept running until I was safely outside. Only then did I turn around, but there was no one there. Shaken, I called the police and told them everything. To my relief, they took it seriously and arrived within minutes. They searched the store thoroughly and eventually found 4 teenagers hiding in the back rooms, laughing hysterically. They had been pulling an elaborate YouTube prank, trying to scare people after hours for their channel. While the police handled the situation, I couldn't shake the lingering unease. What if I hadn't run out when I did? What if their prank had gone further? What do you think? Should stores increase security to prevent pranks like this? And how would you have reacted if you were in my position, alone in an empty store with strange noises and lights going out? As a 22-year-old Target employee, I led a pretty uneventful life. I'd been working there for a while, and it felt like a second home. But what started as just another job quickly turned into a nightmare that ultimately made me quit. It all began with a man, a stranger who appeared to have no reason to be in the store other than to follow me. At first, I didn't think much of it. We had regular customers who shopped weekly, so it wasn't unusual to see familiar faces. But this man was different. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with a healthy build, wearing a half-zip button-up and jeans. I'd never seen him before, yet he began showing up during every one of my shifts. Initially, he'd buy groceries and leave like any normal shopper. Then, over time, his behavior shifted. He'd wander the aisles aimlessly, sometimes without purchasing anything, and every time I glanced his way, we'd make brief eye contact before he quickly looked away. By Sunday of that same week, his appearances had escalated. During my shift, he came into the store not once, but 3 separate times, lingering in the aisles and stealing glances in my direction. By then, the red flags were glaring. He wasn't there to shop. He was there to watch me. I decided that if he showed up one more time, I'd report him to the store manager. But before I could make that decision final, I confided in my coworker Sarah. I pulled her aside during a lull at the checkout counter and explained everything. This guy keeps coming in during my shifts, and he's not even shopping anymore, I told her. Sarah frowned. Have you told anyone else about this? Maybe the manager or security? Not yet, I admitted. I was going to see if he shows up again today. If he does, I'll definitely report it tomorrow. Sarah gave me a reassuring squeeze on the arm. Don't worry. After work, I'll walk you to your car. You won't have to deal with this alone. Her support was comforting, but my relief was short-lived. Almost immediately after our conversation, the man approached my checkout lane. He smiled, stepping far too close for comfort. Hey there, he said casually. How's your day going? You enjoying working here? My stomach churned. I forced myself to maintain composure. I'm just doing my job. Can I help you find something specific? You're such a dedicated worker, he said, grinning. I'm curious, when do you usually get off your shifts? I might have some free time, and it'd be nice to meet up. My heart raced, but I stayed calm, taking a small step back. I'm sorry, but I can't share personal information. It's against our policy. Is there something I can assist you with? Instead of taking the hint, he leaned in closer. No need to be so guarded. I just want to get to know you better. Do you live around here? It'd be convenient for us to spend more time together. My anxiety boiled into anger. I'm not comfortable sharing personal details, I said firmly. Please respect my boundaries and stop asking invasive questions. Ignoring my words, he whispered, You're making it hard for us to connect, but don't worry. I'll find out where you live eventually. Then he smiled, walked away, and exited the store like nothing had happened. After my shift ended, Sarah kept her promise to walk me to my car. The parking lot was nearly empty, with only a handful of cars scattered across the vast space. Despite the quiet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching us. "Stay close," Sarah said, sensing my unease. "We're almost there." As I reached my car and unlocked the door, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. Before I could react, the man grabbed me from behind, his other hand clamping over Sarah's arm. His grip was iron tight, and panic surged through me as I realized how much stronger he was. But adrenaline kicked in, and I remembered the pepper spray in my purse. Somehow, I managed to reach it, spraying a powerful stream directly into his eyes. He howled in pain, releasing both of us as he stumbled back. Without thinking, I turned and kicked him as hard as I could in his most vulnerable spot. Years of playing soccer paid off, and he collapsed to the ground, writhing in agony. Sarah and I didn't wait to see what would happen next. We sprinted to my car, jumped inside, and sped out of the parking lot. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. We called 911 and reported the incident, praying the police would find him before he disappeared. Fortunately, security footage from the store's cameras revealed his identity, and he was caught shortly after. It turned out he had a history of stalking and harassment. He was arrested, given a restraining order, and banned from every Target store in the area. I wish I could say that was the end of it, but the experience stuck with me. I couldn't shake the fear of running into him again, and eventually, I quit my job at Target. What do you think? Could the store have done more to protect employees in situations like this? And what drives people to act in such terrifying and invasive ways?